Shows like Love is Blind are fascinating because they reveal something very real about modern relationships. Welcome to the Conscious Partnership Project. My name is Emily, and today I want to take a look at some of the couples and just kind of dive a little bit deeper into their relationship dynamics, red flags that were missed, patterns that are playing out, and just see what that can teach us about attraction and love. So let's get started. We're going to start with Ashley and Alex. So I'm going to refer to their dynamic as chemistry over depth. So their relationship was really characterized by like shallow flirting. They had this banter back and forth with each other, and right off the bat, they were like very overtly sexual and physical with each other. And so in the moment, I think that that chemistry can feel like connection. It can feel really enticing. And I thought that it was interesting that Ashley, she was able to identify the fact that she has a pattern of being attracted to that type of dynamic, that type of chemistry, but she obviously hadn't yet integrated that lesson. And hopefully through this experience, I think she learned that lesson quite, harshly. But that type of relationship, that type of chemistry, it feels really good in the moment, but it's very much lacking in depth and it's very much unsustainable. So what happens is there's this chemistry, this magnetism, this pull, and it's like enticing, but then when the real life and the real self starts to emerge, there's that lack of compatibility, or as Alex kept stating, he wasn't even really attracted to her, right? Like she wasn't his type, and he never really showed like genuine interest in getting to know her. And he was very like, getting into some of the kind of red flags on his end. He definitely had a lack of transparency. He was not direct in his communication. He made it very difficult for her to ask him questions. There was very much sort of like a manipulativeness to his behavior. Like he was always kind of, throwing it back to her to figure out. So he wasn't forthcoming. He was very withholding. The fact that he had that conversation with Brittany in Mexico where he was talking about not really feeling attracted to Ashley and how Brittany was more his type. It's like, this is a perfect example of a man who has leaking masculine energy, right? So he's supposed to be in this relationship with this one woman in front of him. And instead of being committed to that, his energy is kind of leaking off, even in small, subtle ways, to other places and other things, right? So masculine energy is at its most potent and powerful form when it is committed and directed in one direction. And so in his case, like even just the fact that like lots of ex-girlfriends and things were coming up into question, it's like his energy is very much being pulled in different directions, and he's leaking energy to different people and different things, and that is very much felt in a relationship. And Ashley, her intuition was telling her these things, and she was picking up on these things. And that's the thing, is like when you get deeper below the surface level in relationships, energy doesn't lie, right? And so the feminine is all about intuition, and the feminine is picking up on these little intuitive things. Like Ashley in Mexico had those feelings of discomfort around Alex's conversation with Brittany, but she didn't fully address it, but she made it clear that she was uncomfortable. And then you look back and see the footage, and it's like, yeah, the conversation that he had with Brittany was inappropriate and, disrespectful to her. And as far as Ashley's red flags, it's like she was able to recognize this pattern within herself, but she kind of fell for it all over again. And even like when she first saw him and she was like, yes, like I got the hot guy, you know what I mean? And it's like that that feeling for her was like very fleeting, of like she was the one that got to connect with this kind of like stereotypically hot guy. But then when truth revealed itself, she could see that like, maybe she needs to learn to listen to her intuition a little bit more. So the next couple that I want to get into is Chris and Jessica. And I'm going to refer to Chris and Jessica's dynamic as playing the game. So first, we're just going to dive into Chris because Chris and Jessica they're less about them together than kind of what I think Chris's behavior revealed. So Chris to me is very much a social chameleon. Like he's one of those kinds of people that will say one thing to one person and then one thing to another. He'll transform himself to the person that he's speaking with, and he does it effortlessly and with ease, and he's very good at it, right? And so people like that, they don't generally have a very strong center. So they're not very centered in themselves, right? Like they don't have a very clear like self concept. So they're easy, it's easy for them to shapeshift to kind of mirror what the person in front of them is giving to them. And so there's sort of like a disingenuousness to this. There was a disingenuousness to his entire relationship with Jess because he had expressed in his interviews and whatnot that he was actually interested in Bree. And so it became very evident when he realized that he wasn't going to be the one to connect with Bree that he kind of pivoted to Jessica. And to me, like, obviously we can't speak to his motivations, but it's like if we factor in the fact that this is all happening on TV, we have to kind of put on the table the possibility that people are motivated by their desire to stay on the show, right? So there's that aspect of like playing the game so that you can continue to have the experience, right? And also just the experience itself is like very much the kind of experience that I could see someone easily getting swept up into it, right? So like you're just going to keep going with it because like it's kind of like a vortex, right? And then when they got back into their real life, I think the cracks kind of started to show, and he sort of um, exhibited signs of like self-sabotage, or maybe there was like this conflict within him where he knew that he like had gotten swept up in something that he actually genuinely didn't want to be in. And so there was like this very much kind of hot and cold behavior and like a Jekyll and Hyde switch being flipped where suddenly he was like this totally different person. And like, so, and then another game that he kind of exhibited was like the potential of like the chase, right? So like he kind of lost interest in her after he had kind of gotten her, and then he sort of wanted to go chasing after Bree, and there's like that element of like chasing, what you can't have. Potentially maybe he had a drinking problem, like that was very prevalent in the whole debacle, right? So like obviously he is not a great candidate for conscious partnership at this point in his journey. Everyone is capable of overcoming, difficult aspects of themselves and changing and evolving, but he definitely has a ways to go, right? Jessica's sort of red flags were definitely like getting swept up in the experience and having, a lack of discernment, right? Kind of falling for words over actions. And so he was very wordy, right? Like they were right from the start, they were so like, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. But there wasn't like a lot of the pacing and the energy between the two of them was very frantic. It was very chaotic, right? It didn't feel like there was like a calmness to them. And I'll get into that a little bit more as we move through the rest of the couples. But like, again, this is like that experience of like the chemistry and the excitement of something new that like in your mind you think, oh my god, I wouldn't be feeling this level of excitement and all of these feelings if it wasn't real. But actually, yeah, feeling that level of like just excited chaotic energy is actually like a big indication that like it's not gonna last, right? So like real love, like love that has longevity to it, is a slow burn. That like fiery burst of energy in relationships is not to say it can't be real and it can't be enjoyable, but it's usually not built to last, right? It's usually not sustainable. Um, she couldn't really read that energy, right? Like she couldn't read his energy. And he, not to say that she should, everyone sometimes, has to kind of learn these lessons about like discernment when people are kind of disingenuous, and that you can't always believe the things that people say, right? They have to show themselves to you. And I think that he mirrored her feelings and emotions and excitement back to her very well. And so, tricky situation. And I really felt for her in that. So next couple is Bree and Connor, and their dynamic to me was the most kind of standard of the group, and they kind of exemplify this inverse in polarity or imbalance in polarity between the masculine and feminine. And I think that this is really, really, really common in today's world. So to start with Bree, Bree is very much a woman who is in her masculine energy, right? Like she's kind of like this girl boss in the driver's seat, very controlling. Things have got to be her way. She knows what she likes and she's not afraid to say it. And she's very much like in the driver's seat of life, right? And Connor, on the other hand, was much more like passive, wishy-washy, go with the flow, less kind of open and expressive about like what he wants or even really knowing what he wants. And she kind of, expressed multiple times on the show that what she desired was a man who would take the lead, a man who she didn't have to tell him, we're going here, here, and here, and I'm making the reservation and blah, blah, blah. Like she expressed this desire. And I think this is such a common thing with modern women where they're like, oh, I want this masculine man, but then they fall into this dynamic where the polarity is where they are embodying the masculine, so they become the boss. And she did this multiple times with him throughout the show where she was like, you need to end things with Emma, you need to do, like she was like, we're doing this, we're doing this. And even when they made the decision not to get married on the show, she knew that part of her issue with him was that he wasn't embodying that masculine energy. And I think it's a great decision that they opted out of marriage on the show. They definitely needed more time together, right? And of course, now if you watch the reunion, they're still together, and she says they're planning on marrying each other. And they'll probably have a happy marriage, and that will just be their life together. But they'll probably exhibit the things that you tend to see in these long-term, kind of normal standard relationships where it's like that's going to be their pattern, where she's always going to be the boss, and then it's going to be like she's nagging him, and they're just going to have that dynamic forever, which like fine, they chose that, but it's like a recognition of the fact that within her she actually like on some level desired something else, right? And I think that this is just, it's common because women have been encouraged to like really step into this their masculine energy, and on the inverse of that, men have been demasculated. Like there's been a lot of ways that like modern men have been like broken down, and they've kind of like settled more into this kind of like passive role in life. And so there's been this kind of flip-flopping of like the masculine and the feminine. And so when we talk about conscious partnership, what we're trying to do is we're trying to rebalance those energies within the self, and then that way we can come into more of a harmonic balance with another, right? So moving on to Mike and Emma, I don't have a ton to say about Mike and Emma. They were just fundamentally, their values were not aligned, and I think that Emma wasn't even that interested in Mike. And again, we're encountering a situation where it's like, were we just wanting to stay on the show? Were we just taking, the opportunity that was in front of us because it was there? And like, I really felt with Emma, Mike, obviously, just the fundamental difference in values was always going to be a deal breaker and an issue. With Emma, I could really see, Emma was, I think, one of the youngest on the show. She was only 27. And it's like you could see the ways that Emma was learning to know herself through these connections with other people. And that's exactly where she should be at that point in her life. Like, she didn't need to be deciding in 4 weeks if she wants to have kids and get married, right? So, like, I think this was like a really incredible, learning experience for her, for both of them. So, moving on to Brittany and Devonte, and Brittany and Devonte obviously both were like very outcome driven, especially Brittany. There was a lot of ignoring of red flags, making excuses, right? So like, Brittany obviously really just wanted to be married. She had already bought her wedding dress. Like, she was like eyes on the prize, like, I'm finding a husband. And I think the person in front of her was less relevant than just like having a groom to stand next to her. And I think that that was kind of, that energy was felt by Devonte. And then it was just obvious when they first saw each other that they just were not attracted to each other. And it's like, you know, perfect example of like love is not really blind, right? Like in most cases, like the way that you look and see when you see someone, that's like a big part of connection. And I think that just wasn't there for them. And Brittany right off the bat made comments that like she didn't like his voice, or she called him fat when she first saw him and was like, we're all going to get fat someday. And so their initial hurdles, I think, like very much revealed the incompatibilities that were coming. They had very different communication styles. She really wanted to kind of change him into the person that she wanted him to be, and that never works, right? And so that was kind of, I think, an obvious one that was destined to fail. And then moving on to Jordan and Amber, and the way I would characterize Jordan and Amber is by saying that I think both of them are like almost there, right? They just were not the right people for each other right now. So Jordan had said in his interviews that someone having a kid was like his non-negotiable. It was a deal breaker. And he went back on that, right? Because he really liked Amber. And that's understandable, right? Like, we all kind of do that when we meet someone that we like. It's like, oh, can I change a little bit in this, circumstance? But the truth is, when you have a hard line on something and you meet someone and they are that deal breaker, that non-negotiable, that thing is always going to be the reason that you break up. Always. It's always going to lead to the demise of the relationship, because there's a reason that you set that hard line for yourself. I think, on the positive end, they had a really high degree of openness to each other, and that made their relationship very fun and pleasant and sweet, right? They were both grounded and easygoing and kind of flexible with each other's needs and the ways that they communicated with each other. They had a very sort of supportive conflict resolution, and the desire to work through things instead of like repeating patterns. So they both had that level of awareness where they were able to see, like, okay, this is what I've done in the past and I don't want to do that again. So as when you watch the reunion and they kind of talk about what ended their relationship, like, it was very obvious that they both have some more healing to do, right? So they're both holding on to unhealed patterns of behavior. Like, Jordan is obviously still very attached to like partying and drinking, and that's like a big part of his life. And obviously Amber still has trust issues and issues from past relationships. And so those two things kind of mixed with the fact that I don't think Jordan was ever going to fully commit to like moving out to Mount Vernon to like be a stepdad, I think contributed to the end of that relationship. And then we come to Vic and Christine, and I would call Vic and Christine a divine conscious partnership. They, to me, were the best part of this show. And I just thought that they were such a beautiful example of what conscious partnership can be. And it's like refreshing to see something like that on TV when we look at all the other kind of like dysfunction and stuff that you see on reality TV. And they were just so magical and just adorable. And so when we look at everything we just looked at and all the things I just talked about, all of the patterns, all the different dynamics, how do they stand out and why are they different? Number one, they were locked into each other from the start, right? They met and it was over for everybody else. And they didn't have to, date other people or anything like that. I mean, maybe, the show didn't show it and they did talk to a couple other people, but it was like very obvious that when they met each other, they knew on some level, right? Like that, the connection genuinely was there. And I loved the fact that they both had deep relationships to God individually. And I've talked about this before on my channel, but I do think that this is truly a part of coming into conscious partnership, because your relationship to your spiritual self, to your higher self, to source, to God, is very much reflective of your ability to relate to another, right? And so I thought it was just really beautiful that they both were led by God and had these deep relationships to God. And they both took the entire experience and each other and themselves seriously from the start. And I think that that's really important. Like there was no um, kind of wishy-washiness to it. There was no chaos or uncertainty to it. Like they both knew themselves so well and knew what they wanted so well and knew what they were looking for so clearly that they were able to see it and identify it because they were ready for it and they were open to it. And if we look back at some of, most of the other relationships, there was like that frantic, chaotic energy to it, right? But with them, their energy felt very calm, very grounded, and that, that was that feeling. They exemplify that feeling of like a slow burn, right? So like their feelings were deep and intense, but they weren't chaotic and ungrounded. They were very grounded, very calm. And I thought it was, they were one of the only couples who like they never discussed their intimate experiences with one another, which like these are just little things that it's like it just shows that you're ready to hold a sacred container for relationship, right? So like what's happening between the two of you is private and it's sacred. They were interested in knowing each other deeply from the start. So if you look at their pod interactions versus, let's say like Ashley and Alex, it's like on another level, right? Like it wasn't about, oh, we're gonna hook up or whatever. It was like, I want to know who you are. I want to know exactly what makes you who you are. And of course, he made that statement to her, like, I I could see you before I could see you. And that's really what a conscious partnership is at the end of the day. So I'm curious, which of these couples surprised you the most, and what did these couples teach you about yourself, right? Because these shows are so fascinating because they kind of give us a chance to maybe look a little bit deeper into ourselves and the dynamics that we have experienced in our own relationships, right? So while it's easy to kind of watch from the outside and see like what's obvious in these other people, the real invitation is to kind of look within ourselves and see where we might be doing some of these same things in our relationships. So the real question isn't whether love is blind, it's whether we are willing to see it clearly when it matters the most. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, check out some of my other videos on the channel, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll talk with you again soon.